Hello, I'm John David Bruja, on location, standing in front of Amelia Island Lighthouse in Florida. And welcome to a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner. Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of John's Traveling Movie Corner. United States Lighthouse Society presents the Florida Atlantic Coast Tour. Now on this tour, we hope to see 10 lighthouses, a couple museums, and maybe a boat ride or two, and who knows what else. I hope you enjoy the ride. Well, we had our welcome dinner last night and got to visit all the people who will be traveling with us on this lighthouse tour. So that means today is day 1, and this is our first lighthouse. We get to tour the first lighthouse, and we actually get to climb all the way up and out of the tower. So I call this a lighthouse trifecta. We are at Amelia Island Lighthouse. It is the state's oldest standing lighthouse. Now, I know you're going to send me emails and all this about there's others that are older, but that's because this is the only one from the territorial period to survive without any major rebuilding. In fact, the Amelia Island Lighthouse was working before Florida even became a state. Amelia Island Lighthouse arrived in 1839 at a height of 67 feet. Located on the northernmost barrier island on Florida's Atlantic coast, this is kind of a unique lighthouse because it came from another island, the Cumberland Island. They had a lighthouse from 1820, but unfortunately it was no longer seen in 1838, so Congress appropriated $7,500 to relocate the tower. That's right, they tore it down brick by brick, shipped it across the river, and rebuilt it on Amelia Island. In fact, Winslow Lewis, who built the original lighthouse on Cumberland Island, was there to oversee the project relocation on Amelia Island. The first lighthouse had 14 lamps backed by reflector. Then in 1856, a third order Fresnel lens came. It was unfortunately taken out of service during the Civil War, but returned to service afterwards. In 1881, a new iron lantern room was installed, and it was received a new third order lens in 1903. And the oil house behind me was built in 1890. Now with photographs inside showing different views of the lighthouse. That's right. It's the first lighthouse. I get to go inside, and that's right. Now, after 69 granite steps and 9 iron steps, I made it up to my first lighthouse, Amelia Island Lighthouse. You can see Egan Creek and the Atlantic Ocean in the distance. And of course, there were many range lights, and they were mostly located on the northern part of the island. The city of Fernandina Beach got possession of the lighthouse from the United States Coast Guard in 2001, but the Coast Guard and its auxiliaries still maintain the beacon. When we was at Amelia Island Lighthouse, a group of volunteers from the United States Coast Guard Auxiliary gave us a historical background of the light. And Tom Sintes, a child when his family was lighthouse keepers, answered any other questions we might have had. We stopped in for an excellent lunch and then on to our next destination. And now we are heading toward the St. John's Lighthouse. The St. John's Lighthouse stands at 64 feet and arrived in 1954, and it is the last lighthouse that was built in Florida. and it's located about a mile south of the mouth of the St. Johns River. It was built to replace the lightship, constructed of concrete blocks, and never had a lantern room. Today, a solar-powered beacon sits on top of the flat tower. The lighthouse was automated in 1967, and the dwellings are all gone. The lighthouse is located on the Naval Station Mayport, which covers over 3,409 acres. The St. John's Lighthouse is still active. Ah, that's right. We have not left the Naval Station Mayport yet. We have arrived at our second lighthouse, the St. John's River Lighthouse, which arrived in 1830. The current one behind us at a height of 81 feet in 1859. There has been many lighthouses here. The first in 1830, that was torn down. The one in 1835 nearly burned down. Then, of course, the 1859, which was built of brick with a third order Fresnel lens. While some of the other lighthouses did not operate during the Civil War, this one did until 1864, when apparently the lens was shot out. It was inactive until it received a new third order lens in 1867. The oil house arrived in 1890, and it ended its run in 1931. Shortly after, the lightship Brunswick got a radial beacon in 1928 and later became the St. John's Lightship. Unfortunately, if you're looking for the door that goes to this lighthouse, it's about 8 to 10 feet under the fill dirt when they built the airfield here. For the past 40 years, much debate has been what to do with the lighthouse and or where to move it. After talking with Elizabeth Boggs, who's with the MLA, the Mayport Light Association, it sounds like the decision could be accomplished in the foreseeable future. Well, it's day 2 of traveling to lighthouses, and we've reached our first destination, St. Augustine Lighthouse, where we met Jason, our guide in full uniform, for an hour-long tour of the surrounding area, even taking us across the street from St. Augustine Lighthouse, where we saw the location of the Spanish watchtower that was built in the early 1500s in the original St. Augustine Lighthouse, the first light in Florida that stood here for 143 years until it collapsed into the sea from erosion in 1880. Well, I made it to St. Augustine Lighthouse. The first one was constructed in 1823. The current one behind me in 1874 at 165 feet. And that's right, it's 214 steps to the tower, and I will be climbing all the way up. It received a new lens and lantern, and the tower was reactivated in 1867, but unfortunately erosion became a major factor in the lighthouse longevity. $60,000 was allocated in 1871, $20,000 in 1872, and $25,000 in 1873, and another $20,000 before a new lighthouse and new dwelling, which was finally completed in 1875, and it's the one you see behind me. In 1888, brick kitchens were built on either side of the dwelling. In the 1960s, dwelling boarded up. In 1970, was gutted by an arson fire. And in 1991, the St. Augustine Lighthouse was open to the public for climbing. 165 feet up, 214 steps. I'm at the lantern room in St. Augustine Lighthouse. The tower was electrified in 1936 and the dwelling in 1925. Staffing started in 1955, and the St. Augustine Lighthouse was automated in 1971. In 2000, a new visitor center was built. In 2014, they paid $150,000 to purchase Keeper's House and other property. In between the St. Augustine Lighthouse and the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, we passed by the Castillo de San Marcos National Monument, and then we crossed the Bridge of Lions. We took a break for a great lunch, and then it was on to our next light. Well, I made it to the final lighthouse of the day, and it happens to be the third tallest lighthouse in the U.S. and the tallest in Florida. That's right, it's the Ponce de Leon Lighthouse. The only other taller brick lighthouse is Cape Hatteras. Over 1 million bricks to build this light that stands at 175 feet tall. First constructed in 1835, the current one behind me was built in 1887. It was deactivated in 1970, but reactivated in 1982. Congress appropriated $11,000 for a light at Mosquito Inlet. Winslow Lewis, the guy behind the Cumberland Lighthouse and the moving of Amelia, built the 45-foot conical tower and family dwelling in 1835 and became the first keeper with yearly pay of $450. Later that year, the dwelling was washed into the inlet after a severe storm. Reflectors were swept into the sea in an October storm, and the lighthouse finally collapsed in 1836. Year after year, a request for a light at Mosquito Inlet was denied. Finally, in 1892, it happened, but for $200,000, $193,000 more over the original cost. In 1926, the Mosquito Inlet Lighthouse officially became the Ponce de Leon Inlet Lighthouse, and the first Fresnel lens was replaced by the third, which we saw up in the lantern room. The Coast Guard took over the lighthouse in 1939. The town took over the deed to the property and formed the Ponce de Leon Lighthouse Preservation Association to maintain the facility. It was electrified in 1933. The third order lens was removed in 1971 and shipped to New London, Connecticut, but returned for display in 1973. Ponce de Leon was reactivated in 1982 after a condo blocked the Coast Guard station's light. Automated in 1953, the Coast Guard left the lighthouse in 1970. A third order lens was placed back into the lantern room in 2004. Today, it still serves as a private aid to navigation. Separate dwellings were also built, and it's laid out in the shape of a cross. A brick woodshed was behind each house, and a storage building was built. And the first order lens was placed in the lantern room and lit in 1887. And yes, I did get to climb the 194 steps all the way up to the tower and outside for a spectacular view. Well, I made it up to the lantern room in Ponce de Leon Inlet Lighthouse. And you can see the third order Fresnel lens in action. And behind me is the oil house, and it was the first oil house to be built in the United States to hold kerosene. The dwellings now have artifacts on the lighthouse keepers and the families who lived there. The gift shop was constructed from plans for a multi-family dwelling that was never built. A lens exhibit building built in 1995. You even get a chance to see the Cape Canaveral first order Fresnel lens that used to be in that lighthouse. And you can even see the first order Fresnel lens that was used in the Ponce de Leon Inlet Lighthouse down below. And yes, that is one from the Titanic. Now, Carlene and I like to go on other adventures, especially before a major lighthouse tour. And we did it on this one too. 2-3 days before we go to Jacksonville and start our lighthouse tour in Florida, Carlene and I headed down to South Carolina, and our first stop was Charleston. We like to call these pit stops. And welcome to our first pit stop. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, on Sullivan's Island, standing in front of the Charleston Lighthouse. Construction started in 1960, and the Charleston Lighthouse was first lit in June of 1962. Also known as Sullivan's Island Lighthouse, it was designed by Tom Sullivan, and was built to replace Morris Island Lighthouse. Built with a steel frame with an aluminum alloy skin, it was originally painted white and red-orange, but later painted white and black. Standing at 162.5 feet tall, the Charleston Lighthouse was the last major lighthouse built in the United States. It is the only lighthouse with an elevator and air conditioning, and the Charleston Lighthouse was automated in 1975. Welcome to another pit stop, Fort Sumter. Construction was nearly completed in 1861, but on April 12th of that same year, the Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter and the Civil War began. A three-tier structure with brick walls 50 feet high and 5 feet thick. It could support 135 guns and 650 men. And that's right, on one of these corners existed a lighthouse. Unfortunately, it's no longer standing. But you can see the Charleston Lighthouse and Morris Island Lighthouse in the distance from Fort Sumter. Welcome to another pit stop. I'm standing in front of St. Philip's Church in downtown Charleston. And that's right, it is actually a lighthouse. It is Fort Sumter's Rear Range Lighthouse. We saw the steeple as we approached the dock and even saw a dolphin or two. The Fort Sumter Rear Range light was in the steeple of St. Philip's Church and was lit from 1893 to 1915 when it was finally discontinued. It stood at a height of 140 feet. Now there are small range lights that do exist in the Charleston Harbor, but none of them are at the fort itself. Well, that concludes episode 1 of John's Traveling Movie Corner. United States Lighthouse Society presents the Florida Atlantic Coast Lighthouse Tour. I hope you stay tuned and catch the next episode. I would like to thank the volunteers and staff for allowing us access in and all the way up and out around the tower of Amelia Island Lighthouse. And a special thank you to Tom Sintes, who was a child of a lighthouse keeper, with all of his knowledgeable information. And as you can imagine, being on a naval station, access to this lighthouse is limited. So I would like to thank the Naval Station Mayport and Heather Uton for allowing us access and up to the St. John's Lighthouse. I would like to thank the volunteers and staff at the St. Augustine Lighthouse for providing us access to and inside the tower and all the way up to the lighthouse, and Jason for his extraordinary information on the area. And I would like to thank the volunteers and staff at the Ponce de Leon Lighthouse for allowing us access inside and all the way up and outside the tower. And I would like to thank the volunteers and staff at the National Park Service for getting us to and allowing us access inside one of the most historic forts in America. And I would like to thank the captain and the crew of the Palmetto Spirit for getting us safely to and from Fort Sumter. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I'm John David Bruja, on location, standing in front of the Ponce de Leon Inlet Lighthouse. This has been a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner. United States Lighthouse Society presents the Florida Atlantic Coast Lighthouse Tour. I hope you enjoyed the ride. you.